Well, now you know more than you ever thought possible about muscle cell contraction and behaviors. We now switch to metabolic processes and how they make their ATP. This is related to twitch speed. Muscle cells have three options for making ATP. But first, a little about ATP. This molecule is adenosine triphosphate. It is an adenosine with three phosphate groups attached. The third phosphate group is high energy and it pretty much falls off. When it falls off, we use it to do some kind of work. For example, if we stick that phosphate to the myosin head, we can break the cross bridge. Now, when that third phosphate falls off, we are left with adenosine diphosphate. ATP is so high energy that there's no way to store it, and it is used as it is made. Since we can't store energy as pure ATP, that means we have to store energy in some other way. This energy needed to make ATP is stored within the chemical bonds of other molecules. What cells will do is break those other molecules, then use that energy to make ATP. Creatine phosphate. This molecule allows for a quick recycling of ATP from ADP and another phosphate. Creatine phosphate recycling is limited and only lasts a few seconds before it is depleted. This method is used by all cells. Anaerobic metabolism, so called because oxygen is not needed. First, the cell will start with a 6-carbon glucose molecule. That is broken in half during glycolysis, and the energy is used to make some ATP. The cell then uses the 3-carbon pieces in fermentation to make lactic acid. That fermentation does not give us more ATP but allows the cell to continue running glycolysis. This method lasts a few minutes, but eventually the cells will run out of glucose. This method is used by all muscle cells but is the only option for certain fast twitch cells. Aerobic metabolism, so called because oxygen is required. First, the cell still starts with glycolysis and breaking a 6-carbon glucose into 2 3-carbon pieces. Each piece is then given to the mitochondria. The mitochondria will run the 3-carbon piece, pyruvate, in a cycle, the Krebs cycle, then a final process, oxidative phosphorylation. The end result is a ton of ATP. Now, not only can the cells use aerobic mechanisms to make a lot of ATP, they end up having options. Once the glucose runs out after a few minutes, these cells can switch to using fat supplies. Why? Because the chemistry of the Krebs cycle is very flexible. A cell just needs a carbon-based molecule. It doesn't have to be from glucose. So once that glucose runs out, the cell starts to break down fat molecules and plugs those into the Krebs cycle process. This means that these cells produce ATP for hours and hours. Obviously, this means these cells need mitochondria. And because oxygen is part of the last step, it also means these cells need lots of oxygen. If they are robbed of oxygen, they'll stop aerobic and switch to anaerobic. To quickly review, creatine phosphate recycles ATP and lasts a few seconds. Anaerobic metabolism, glycolysis, and fermentation break glucose and produces ATP but only lasts a few minutes. Aerobic metabolism, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, oxidative phosphorylation, breaks glucose and fats and lasts for hours. Now we can overlap metabolic processes to the twitch speed. Fast glycolytic cells go through their contraction cycle quickly and rely on glycolysis and fermentation. As a result, they tire quickly. Slow oxidative are the opposite. They contract slowly but run aerobic metabolism and can contract for hours without tiring. Fast oxidative are a compromise between the two. They have a fast twitch speed but can run oxidative metabolism and contract for a long time without tiring. Now, compare the explosive and short-term action of a sprinter to the slower and long-term action of a marathon runner. Which activity is more suited to fast-twitch glycolytic oxidative cells? Which is more suited to slow-twitch oxidative cells? Humans have all cell types in their muscles. However, not every muscle is a complete mixture of the three. Remember the lateral rectus of your eye? That's primarily fast glycolytic. However, the soleus calf muscle is mostly slowly oxidative. Within that, there are differences between human beings. Some of us have just a bit more of one versus the other in our muscles. Michael Phelps is famous, but during one Olympics, he became even more famous because he won gold medals in sprints and long swims. That's highly unusual because athletes tend to be one or the other because of the makeup of fibers within their muscles. Think about this and talk to each other about it in the A&P Cafe. And here's another example, white meat versus dark meat. White meat contains mostly fast glycolytic cell types. These muscles do not store fat because they don't use fat in metabolism. They also do not have a high blood supply because they're mostly anaerobic and don't need the extra oxygen. However, dark meat is the opposite. These cells are found in thighs and legs and are weight-bearing, so they need to contract for hours on end, which means they are slow oxidative. As a result, they store fat for use in metabolism and need an extra rich blood supply for the high oxygen demand. In addition to metabolism, aerobic and anaerobic can refer to exercise stimulus on skeletal muscles. Depending on how you stimulate the muscle, you will see different responses. Aerobic exercise like running, dancing, walking, swimming stimulates muscles to adapt for aerobic metabolism. So we generally see more blood supply, mitochondria, and myoglobin in the cell. Myoglobin allows muscle cells to move oxygen into the mitochondria. Anaerobic exercise such as weight training results in different changes. When a skeletal muscle cell contracts to move a load that is heavier than what it is adapted for, the myofibrils tear. However, the cell responds by replacing and repairing the myofilaments. With continued weight training and continued tearing, the muscle cell adapts over time by making more myofilaments. These cells also increase the glucose stored in them by making more glycogen and more mitochondria. If you exercise a muscle to the point of it running out of ATP, you force it into fatigue. Ion balances occur, lactic acid builds up, and the myofibrils are torn. The cell then goes into oxygen debt, where it replaces and repairs to return to homeostasis. This fatigue debt cycle is called the overload principle. Skeletal muscle cells always adapt to their stimulus. If you want them to continue to adapt and change, you must continue to overload them. Those who work out with weights know that after a month or so, the muscles get used to lifting that weight. In order to continue to improve on performance, the person must either increase the weight or lift more sets. Now, let's look at how different smooth muscle is from skeletal. As a reminder, cardiac uses the same sliding filament form of contraction as skeletal. It does not do extreme graded responses and is slow twitch oxidative and slow to tire in nature. Structurally, smooth muscle cells have endomysium only and often occur in thick sheets of thousands and thousands of cells. When in the walls of hollow organs, they can sometimes be found in longitudinal and circular planes. Functionally, smooth muscle can cause glands to secrete or control a tubular organ. Peristalsis is wave-like contraction to push something through a tubular organ. Segmentation is a back and forth contraction for mixing. Dilation and constriction change the diameter of a tubular organ. Lastly, some smooth muscle relaxes when stretched, but other cells may contract when stretched. Smooth muscle cells are not striated. This is due to the myofibril arrangements. Instead of being full of myofibrils perfectly stacked on each other, these cells have superficial myofibrils that are cross-hatched instead. Since the myofibrils are superficial, there's no need for deep T-tubules. So, the sarcolemma have short invaginations called caveoli. Some smooth muscle cells can self-depolarize when stretched. Most smooth muscle cells in the sheets are coupled by gap junctions to ensure that they contract together in large units. Also, smooth muscle does not have terminal neuromuscular junctions. The motor neurons here have synapses that occur in chains and are called varicosities. To review, smooth muscle cells are not striated, do not have T-tubules, but caveoli, however you want to say it, instead. They do not have terminal neuromuscular junctions, but varicosities instead. They can self-depolarize. They are coupled with gap junctions. They contract in sheets. Smooth muscle cells do not use the troponin complex. Instead, release calcium binds with a calmodulin, an enzyme complex. This then activates myosin to form cross bridges and power strokes. Also, smooth muscle can grow by cell division. There are two types of smooth muscle. The type we just talked about is called single unit. You can see all the characteristics here. There is a type of smooth muscle that behaves more like skeletal muscle. That tissue, multi-unit, is found in a few places: large arteries, large airways, erector peeling muscles on our hair follicles, and inside the eye. Note how multi-unit has motor units, rare gap junctions, doesn't self-depolarize, has graded responses, and has cells that are independent. Congratulations! You've just finished Bio 2050. A very time-consuming, challenging, and stressful course. Don't forget what you've learned. You'll need it in Bio 2060, as well as pharmacy school, PT school, med school, nursing school.